contact appeared on no threat display. It produced no radar return, no infrared signature, no acoustic footprint that any automated system in the escort formation had been programmed to classify as hostile. It was, by every conventional measurement available to the surface ships transiting the Gulf of Oman on March 16, 2026, simply not there. The MH-60R helicopter operating from USS Farragut was the first to find it, and only because its crew was doing something that no automated system does. They were looking at the water. Specifically, the airborne tactical officer in the helicopter's right seat had been running a continuous visual scan of the surface beneath their flight path since 2:47 a.m., a practice that his training described as supplementary to the acoustic sensor suite, and that 14 years of maritime patrol experience had taught him was, in certain sea states and at certain hours, more reliable than the systems it supplemented. At 2:51 a.m., at an altitude of 300 feet, flying a standard lawnmower pattern search leg 7 nautical miles ahead of the formation, he observed a luminescent wake. It was narrow, perhaps 40 centimeters wide at the surface, and it curved with the precise, purposeful geometry of something under directional control, rather than the diffuse, irregular patterns of biological bioluminescence or wave action. It was running on a northward bearing at what he estimated as 12 to 15 knots. It was running directly toward the formation. He called it, at 2:52 a.m., as a possible subsurface contact. Bearing 227, range 7.3 nautical miles from USS Farragut. He deployed a pattern of 4 sonobuoys across the contact's projected track at 2:53 a.m. The first 2 sonobuoys produced nothing. The contact was either too deep, too quiet, or both for their passive sensors to acquire. The third sonobuoy, dropped at the leading edge of the projected track at 2:54 a.m., produced a signal that the ATO had never encountered in training and had encountered once before in operational service. The high-frequency, narrow-band acoustic signature of an electric propulsion motor running at maximum output in a pressure hull smaller than any standard submarine architecture. Not a submarine. Something considerably smaller than a submarine, and considerably more difficult to detect because of it. He transmitted the classification at 2:55 a.m. Probable unmanned underwater vehicle, hostile aspect, bearing 227. The transmission reached USS Farragut's Combat Information Center in 1.3 seconds. The tactical action officer had the report, the sonobuoy data, and the ATO's visual contact description on her display simultaneously at 2:55:09 a.m. She classified it as a threat contact at 2:55:11 a.m. She had 2 seconds of certainty and a decision that the 2 seconds could not make for her. What was in the water had been developed by the IRGC Navy's Underwater Systems Program over 26 months, under a program designation that Western intelligence analysts had tracked through procurement records, component shipments, and a single fragmentary technical assessment from a human intelligence source that had gone dark in November 2025. The vehicle, which Iranian engineers had designated the Razm-3, Persian for combat, was an autonomous underwater vehicle approximately 4 meters in length, carrying a shaped charge warhead in its forward section and a guidance architecture that combined inertial navigation, acoustic homing on large displacement vessel signatures, and a terminal phase active sonar seeker. Its electric propulsion system had been designed specifically around acoustic minimization. The motor's frequency signature had been tuned to operate in a band that overlapped with common biological noise sources in the Gulf of Oman's acoustic environment. A design choice that had required 18 months of acoustic testing in Iranian coastal waters and had produced a vehicle that was, in ideal conditions, genuinely difficult to distinguish from the background noise floor of a biologically active shallow water maritime environment. The IRGC had deployed 6 of them, not from a submarine, the U.S. Navy's persistent anti-submarine coverage of the Gulf of Oman had made submarine operations in this area an unacceptable risk since the opening days of the conflict. They had been deployed from the seafloor, specifically from 6 pre-positioned launch canisters that had been placed on the Gulf of Oman seafloor by an Iranian commercial diving support vessel operating under a salvage contract. A vessel that had legitimate access to these waters, a legitimate business registration in Oman, and a manifest that described its cargo as undersea pipeline survey equipment. The canisters had been placed at 4:15 a.m. on March 12th, 4 days earlier. They had rested on the seafloor at 340 meters depth, powered down, cold, and acoustically inert for 91 hours. At 2:41 a.m. on March 16th, they had received a coded acoustic activation signal transmitted from an IRGC signals asset operating from a fishing vessel in the Strait's eastern approach corridor. A signal that woke the vehicles, ran their pre-launch diagnostic sequences, and released them from their canisters on pre-programmed intercept courses calculated against the formation's projected track. The planning had been built around one central intelligence product: the formation's transit schedule. The USS Farragut-led escort group, 3 surface combatants escorting 2 VLCC crude oil tankers from the Fujairah offshore terminal to the Strait of Hormuz, had been operating under a transit schedule that had been transmitted in an encrypted format through a logistics coordination channel shared with the UAE's Federal Transport Authority. The encryption on that channel had been assessed as secure. The assessment had been wrong. IRGC Signals Intelligence had been reading the logistics coordination channel for 11 days. They had known the formation's entry time, entry point, and transit speed. They had calculated the intercept geometry for 6 RASM-3 vehicles, assigned 2 to each tanker, and held 2 in reserve for the escort vessels. The mathematics of the attack, from the planner's perspective, were straightforward. 2 autonomous underwater vehicles approaching a VLCC from different bearings simultaneously, with acoustic homing and an active seeker in terminal phase, would present a defense problem that a surface combatant's standard ASW response suite was not designed to solve in the available engagement timeline. The RASM-3's terminal sprint speed was estimated at 32 knots, at 7 nautical miles. With a formation speed of 14 knots, the engagement timeline from detection to impact, if detection occurred at all, was approximately 14 minutes. The ATO in the MH-60R had found the first vehicle at 7.3 nautical miles. He had 13 minutes and 40 seconds. USS Farragut's tactical action officer committed the ship to ASW engagement posture at 2:55:14 a.m. 3 seconds after receiving the contact report, 2 seconds after classifying it as a threat. She ordered all surface ships in the formation to begin active sonar transmissions on the bearing of the contact. The formation's active sonars, which had been operating in passive mode to reduce acoustic self-noise, switched to active pinging at 2:55:19 a.m. The pings did not immediately resolve additional contacts. The RASM-3S approaching from bearings other than 227 were still inside the acoustic noise floor. But the active transmissions altered the acoustic environment in a way that the vehicle's onboard systems had not been programmed to handle. The sudden introduction of multiple overlapping active sonar fields at varying frequencies created an interference pattern that degraded the acoustic homing accuracy of 3 of the 5 remaining vehicles by a margin their guidance algorithms could not fully compensate for. The MH-60R crew had, in the meantime, performed the most important action available to them. They had repositioned. The ATO had his pilot bring the helicopter to a hover directly above the sonobuoy that had produced the contact signal, dropped a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo at 2:56:11 a.m., and then immediately repositioned to a new search leg to hunt the contacts he knew, from the geometry of the attack, must exist on other bearings. The Mk-54 acquired the RASM-3 on its active seeker at 2:56:34 a.m., The intercept occurred at 2:56:41 a.m. at a depth of 87 meters. The vehicle was destroyed, 6 nautical miles from the nearest tanker. At 2:57 a.m., the active sonar returns from USS Farragut and USS Roosevelt began producing contacts. Not 7 nautical miles out, the remaining vehicles had closed during the 65 seconds since the first detection, and the active sonar was now pinging on contacts at ranges between 4.1 and 5.8 nautical miles on 3 separate bearings. 5 contacts, 3 ships, and 1 helicopter to engage them. A formation that had been designed for transit escort, not for simultaneous multi-bearing UUV engagement, executing in real time against a threat type that was not yet incorporated into any standard defensive tactics manual, because no Navy had ever encountered it in combat before this morning. The commanding officer of USS Farragut was in the CIC. He had been there since 2:40 a.m., when a routine review of the formation's acoustic environment had produced a trace he had wanted to watch personally. Nothing definitive, nothing he could classify, just an instinct formed by 22 years in surface warfare. That the Gulf of Oman was quieter than it should have been on a night with a following sea and moderate biological activity. He had been watching the right display at the right moment when the ATO's contact report came in, and he had understood immediately what the 5-bearing threat picture meant. He ordered the 2 tankers to emergency sprint and zigzag at 2:57:09 a.m. and simultaneously authorized weapons free on all contacts to all available assets. The next 9 minutes were the most tactically demanding ASW engagement the surface Navy had conducted since the Cold War. USS Roosevelt's hull-mounted sonar acquired a contact at 4.7 nautical miles, bearing 105 at 2:57:22 a.m. The ship's torpedo defense system automatically deployed decoys, acoustic countermeasures designed to replicate a large vessel's hull signature and draw homing weapons away from the ship. The decoy deployment was correct procedure. Against a standard torpedo, it was highly effective. Against the RASM-3's terminal active sonar seeker, which operated on a frequency band that the standard decoy suite's emission profile did not fully cover, it was partially effective. The vehicle's homing shifted toward the decoy at 2:57:41 a.m., but did not fully break lock. Roosevelt's torpedo defense system detected the partial lock maintenance and triggered a second decoy at 2:57:49 a.m. The vehicle's seeker, now processing 2 decoy signatures and 1 genuine hull signature in overlapping returns, selected the second decoy at 2:57:53 a.m. The RASM-3 detonated against the decoy at 2:58:11 a.m., 2.1 nautical miles from Roosevelt's hull. The shockwave was detectable on the ship's hull sensors. Nothing else reached the ship. The MH-60R crew, working without pause, had repositioned to the bearing 105 contact after the Farragut's sonar feed showed the Roosevelt contact resolving, and the ATO was already building a firing solution when the decoy detonation removed that contact from the picture. He shifted immediately to the next unengaged contact. Bearing 331, range 4.2 nautical miles from the northernmost tanker. He dropped his second mark, 54, at 2:58:44 a.m. The torpedo acquired at 2:58:59 a.m. Intercept at 2:59:08 a.m. 3 contacts neutralized. 3 remaining. The remaining 3 RASM-3s. 2 assigned to the southern tanker, 1 held in reserve that had been redirected against Farragut following the decoy detonation. Were now inside 3 nautical miles of their targets in terminal phase. Their active seekers pinging against the acoustic environment with the focused, mechanical certainty of systems that do not experience the events happening around them and do not adjust for losses. They had been programmed for a specific task. They were executing it. At 2:59:19 a.m., the leading RASM-3 approaching the southern tanker was at 2.3 nautical miles and closing. USS Farragut's torpedo defense system had been tracking it since 2:58:02 a.m. and had been attempting to build an intercept solution using the ship's torpedo defense module. A system that had been designed for torpedo defense, not UUV defense. But that was the only intercept-capable system currently available on the correct bearing. The targeting solution was imperfect. The RASM-3's acoustic profile was sufficiently different from a standard torpedo that the TDS's tracking algorithm was producing a position estimate with a confidence interval wider than ideal. The torpedo defense officer, monitoring the system's output, made the decision that the automated system could not make. He accepted the imperfect solution and fired at 2:59:31 a.m. The countermeasure reached the RASM-3's projected position at 2:59:44 a.m. It did not produce a direct intercept. It detonated within 11 meters of the vehicle, and the pressure wave from the detonation was sufficient to rupture the vehicle's pressure hull and disable its guidance system. The RASM-3 continued forward on its last programmed heading for 4.3 seconds, then diverged from the tanker's track by 17 degrees and passed astern at a distance of 340 meters. The tanker's crew, locked down in their muster stations below the waterline per emergency procedures, heard the detonation at 2:59:44 a.m. as a sharp, compressed concussion through the hull. They did not know what it was. They knew it had not hit them. The MH-60R took the fifth contact at 3:17 a.m. with its third and final torpedo. The vehicle was at 1.8 nautical miles from the northern tanker when the Mark 54 acquired it. Intercept at 3:29 a.m. The sixth contact. The reserve vehicle that had been redirected against Farragut was engaged at 3:01:02 a.m. by a combination of torpedo decoys and the helicopter's repositioned sonobuoy screen, which had reacquired the vehicle at 1.1 nautical miles. The ATO had no more Mark 54s. He had used 3. He directed Farragut's TDS to engage on the sonobuoy-derived targeting data at 3:01:07 a.m. and simultaneously deployed his remaining sonobuoys in a barrier pattern to channel the vehicle toward the decoy field. The TDS fired at 3:01:14 a.m. The vehicle entered the decoy field at 3:01:29 a.m., lost lock on Farragut's hull signature, and circled in the decoy field for 53 seconds before its battery depleted and it descended to the seafloor at 3:02:22 a.m. Inert, neutralized by exhaustion rather than by kinetic engagement, which is a less satisfying resolution but an equally effective one. At 3:03 a.m., the threat display on USS Farragut showed 0 active contacts. The engagement had lasted 11 minutes and 11 seconds from first detection to final contact neutralization. All 6 RASM-3 vehicles were accounted for. 0 successful impacts on protected vessels. 0 personnel casualties. But the accounting of what it had cost to reach that outcome was not 0. The MH-60R had expended its entire torpedo loadout. USS Roosevelt had expended 14 torpedo decoys, more than half its available supply. Farragut's TDS had expended 9 countermeasures. The encrypted logistics coordination channel through which the formation's transit schedule had been compromised was immediately taken offline and would remain so pending a full signal security audit that would consume 11 days of cryptographic staff time and produce a forensic assessment that identified the specific vulnerability in the UAE Federal Transport Authority's endpoint security architecture. A vulnerability that had been introduced, the assessment would conclude, by a piece of software installed during a routine system update 7 weeks earlier by a contractor whose parent company had been acquired 14 months before, by a holding firm registered in Cyprus with beneficial ownership that resolved, through 4 layers of corporate structure, to a financial entity with documented ties to an IRGC procurement network. They had been reading the schedule for 11 days. They had placed the canisters on the seafloor 91 hours before the formation transited. They had waited with the patience of systems that do not get tired, in water that does not change, for a formation that arrived exactly when the schedule said it would. At 5:44 a.m., 5th Fleet Command transmitted a classified assessment to CENTCOM and the NSC documenting the engagement and its intelligence implications. The assessment noted, without emphasis but with complete clarity, that the Razm-3 vehicle represented a qualitative evolution in Iranian underwater warfare capability. A system designed specifically to operate below the detection threshold of standard surface escort ASW architectures, deployed through a logistics method that exploited legitimate maritime access, and activated through an acoustic command channel that was entirely passive until the moment of launch. The assessment recommended immediate modification of the acoustic detection threshold standards for all surface ships operating in Gulf waters, immediate replacement of the compromised logistics encryption architecture, and immediate expansion of the MH-60R ASW patrol protocols to include pre-transit seafloor survey sweeps along scheduled formation routes. The recommendation for pre-transit seafloor surveys was the most operationally significant of the three. It acknowledged, in the formal language of an official assessment, what the engagement had demonstrated in the informal language of 11 minutes and 11 seconds, that the threat had moved beneath the waterline, beneath the detection thresholds that surface escort architecture had been built around, and that finding it before it launched required the kind of investment in persistent, pre-positional surveillance that is expensive, time-consuming, and entirely invisible until the moment it is the only thing that would have mattered. The two tankers completed their transit of the Strait of Hormuz at 8:22 a.m. Their combined cargo represented 4.1 million barrels of crude oil, approximately 4 hours of global consumption at pre-conflict rates, worth roughly $400 million at the prices that energy markets were recording that morning. Neither tanker's crew knew the precise sequence of events that had occurred 7 nautical miles ahead of them between 2:51 a.m. and 3:03 a.m. They knew the escort had engaged an underwater threat and neutralized it. They knew they were proceeding. The value of what had been protected, in barrels, in dollars, in the operational signal that the escort remained effective, was the kind of value that does not appear in any congratulatory message or unit commendation. It appears in the continued movement of tankers through water that an adversary had chosen as a battle space, and in the particular, daily normalcy of a world that continues to function. Because somewhere below its surface, people are paying attention. In naval warfare, the threat you do not detect is the one that finds the gap. The one you detect at 7 miles at 2:51 a.m. by looking at the water is the one that does not.